Now we're on to our final keynote speaker. Been waiting a long time for this. I've known this man since probably 2005. Our friend David Harris from Red Wing said, "Oh, you got to come up to Minneapolis and listen to this fellow speak." And boy, I was impressed. And a few years later, I think it was 2008, he decided he was going to run for U.S. Senate from Minnesota. And he was going around the state, and I invited him to come to Red Wing for a campaign talk. He hadn't officially announced his candidacy, but I invited him anyway, and we had a good turnout here in Red Wing. And Red Wing was the place where he officially announced his candidacy for U.S. Senate, right here in Little Red Wing. Anyway, that was a special night, because we all wanted Jack to be our next senator, but we had to get Al Franken, which he wasn't bad either, but I would have preferred Jack Nelson Pallmeyer. And I hope maybe he'll run again. I don't know. I hope, but no. But Jack is a peace and justice professor at St. Thomas University, and he's written a lot of books and well known far and wide. And I'm glad to have you. I'll offer him to come here and speak to us today about our topic. So please welcome Jack Nelson Pallmeyer.
Can you hear me okay? All right. Well, so the topic is militarism providing security we seek? No.
Hey!
You might actually appreciate that if it would just be done. So I thought you've heard so many words. I'm just going to lead with one fun fact. It really, could you get that for me? It's a little bit related to the topic, but not really, but you'll probably forget most of what I say, but you can remember the fun fact. That more people in the United States each year are killed by furniture than by terrorists. That's the fun fact. And that can come in handy because maybe you want to have a conversation with people, and maybe that will get them thinking about the trillions of dollars that we've spent on the war on terror, the millions of lives that have been lost.
God with IKEA.
And maybe, Steve Clemens was saying that too, that maybe we should protest at IKEA. All right. So, I believe actually that militarism is probably one of the greatest obstacles that we have to human fulfillment and to having a meaningful future before us. And we know that militarism is somehow connected with violence, but I want to ask and talk about really two things, or two questions, focusing my words tonight. And the first one is, I really think we have to wrestle with what is violence, and then very much, even more so, we need to really wrestle with what is militarism, because we throw the term around a lot, and sometimes I think we're missing some things that are really important. So I'm going to try to talk about that. But the first question then is about violence. And I know that I grew up with a pretty simple idea of violence. Violence especially was if you took out a gun and you shot somebody or you were shot. And it really wasn't until after I lived in Central America and I saw the impact of U.S. low-intensity, so-called low-intensity wars, and the backing of repressive governments, and the toleration or encouragement of torture, and the role of the School of the Americas, and all of those things, that I was really deeply impacted by some of the ideas that came out of liberation theology. And I don't know if any of you have paid any attention to that, but one of my professors in seminary years and years ago was Gustavo Gutierrez, liberation theologian from Peru. Anyway, the topic of violence came up a lot in Central America, and oftentimes it was accusing the Catholic Church and the Progressive Church with fomenting violence. So in the midst of that, I learned a lot about violence, because one of the things that the liberation theologians talked about, and people who were part of base communities and faithful communities working for justice, was they demanded that we pay more attention to what violence really was. And the way that they laid that out is they talked about a spiral of violence. And it had, in their view, it had three spokes. The first spoke, the first violence, was oppression and poverty and hunger. So the context in which they were making reflection on violence was after years and years and many, many decades of U.S. engagement in Latin America that really helped implement a national security states in many of these countries and just created horrible living conditions for most people. And so in liberation theology, when they talk about the spiral of violence, the first violence was oppression and poverty and needless death. And then they said, well, the second violence is when some people who experience that injustice use violent means in response to try to bring about a social change. And the third violence was the violence of the state and the violence of death squads and paramilitary groups and repressive militaries, most of them trained by the United States, throughout Latin America. And this spiral would just deepen and deepen and deepen. Now, they also said that we have some lessons that we could learn from, if we pay attention to what I just said. There were implications. One of the implications was, if you cared about violence, then you had to work for justice. You had to work to change these oppressive systems. Another was, if you cared about violence, you had to withdraw your support from repressive governments and work on behalf of social change. But another one was that using violent means to try to bring about change was morally permissible. But unfortunately, it almost always failed. Because when oppressed people chose violent means, they chose to wage the fight on the playing field at which their adversary excelled. It was hard to out-violence violent states, especially violent states that were backed by the violence of the United States. Another lesson we might learn is that even where it was possible that violent movements working for change succeeded, in quotes, the destruction of those nations was unbelievable. Think of Vietnam, think of Iraq, and the asymmetrical warfare. You could argue that somehow worked. But as we heard from Sammy today, Iraq will never be the same. Laos will never be the same. Vietnam will never be the same. So another lesson that we might learn, and it would be very helpful for us in the context of thinking about alternative ways of being secure, is that we should really be wrestling with finding nonviolent ways of working for social change and social justice, including when we are up against oppressive governments and other things. We desperately need effective nonviolent strategies to resist injustice and to work for more just societies. Now, unrelated to liberation theology, we have King and we have Gandhi and we have our own common sense that tells us that violence almost always breeds more violence. Now, I will just say that in my talking about this, teaching about this, writing about this, engaging in this, I also name a fourth spiral. It's not just the oppression, it's not just the rebellion, the violent rebellion, it's not the repression that follows from the state. There's something that I can't come up with a good name for it, but what I've called it is kind of deflective, dysfunctional violence. It's the violence that results when societies break down. Now we can give a simple example of if you underinvest in any community, say North Minneapolis, you're going to have a lot of dysfunctional violence. Dysfunctional, deflective violence isn't violence that people use to try to change unjust systems. It's the violence that results from social breakdown. And we see a lot of that around the world. In fact, I would argue that the longest lasting injustices resulting from every U.S. military involvement since World War II is dysfunctional, deflective violence that results from the destruction of the societies that we intervene supposedly for good purposes. Now, so that's violence. And militarism is a form of violence. We're aware of that. And we know that the spiral violence just worsens when we use violence. So we have to ask ourselves why, given a historical record in which almost every activity, U.S. military activity worldwide since World War II, has resulted in one disaster after another. It's very, very difficult to name a successful use of U.S. military intervention in any of the areas of the world where it has happened. If you can name many, I would be surprised. So despite abundant evidence of absolute disgusting failures and results, why is it then that the military budget is still the most privileged item in any federal budget? Why is it that the Pentagon is given more money even than it asked for, whether it's by Democrats or Republicans? Why is it, after all these failures, that the U.S. military is the most popular or the most trusted institution in the nation according to polls? How is that possible? And the answer, I think, is that we have misunderstood militarism at its heart. And I owe a great deal of gratitude to a feminist peace studies person named Betty Reardon. And Betty Reardon made a distinction. And she says we need to understand that militarism is a belief system. Militarism is a belief system in the usefulness, the effectiveness of violence. I had a New Testament professor, some of you who are Christian may understand from a nonviolent perspective. He probably did the most to talk about the nonviolence of any other theologian I know other than myself. And that would be Walter Wink. And I remember Walter Wink was asked, what is the most important religion in the world? He didn't say Christianity, he didn't say Islam, he didn't say Hinduism, he didn't say Buddhism. He said the most important religion in the world is violence. Because all around the world, whether you are a communist or you're a socialist or you're a capitalist, whether you're an oppressed person or a general, people believe somehow that violence saves. So we have to come to terms with how deeply embedded this belief system in the usefulness of violence is. Because it explains, to me at least, why we constantly move down roads that we should go, are dead ends. So militarism is the belief system. What militarization is the translation of that belief system into policies and into priorities. So we see, because of this belief system, what kind of policies do we see? We see enormous military budgets. We see terrible housing, terrible poverty. We see the United States ranking last or near last in every single measurement of social well-being compared to other developed countries. Why do we invade others? Because of the belief system. Why do we napalm Vietnam? Why did we put the cluster bombs in Laos? Why did we create national security states throughout Latin America in the 1950s and 1960s? Why did we train soldiers throughout Latin America, including engaging in terror tactics? Because of this belief system. You implement policies and priorities related to that. And I won't take the time to read it, but you might remember the quote from Dwight Eisenhower back in 1953, in which he said basically, every gunship we build, every rocket we fire is a theft from the poor. It is a theft from the poor. And maybe I'll say more about this later on, but it seems to me that if we are to broaden the base of people who are committed to peace, we're going to need to connect this belief system, challenge the belief system, and connect all the destructive things that happen as a result of militarized priorities to things that they actually care about. The quality of the education of their children, the quality of the access to the health system that we have. People are concerned about many things. We would share with all kinds of people who differ with us politically on a lot of other stuff. I think we need to find a language that connects. And part of that has to do with linking these enormous costs to the wasteful wars, the wasteful interventions, the wasteful production systems, the absolute destruction, and all the opportunity costs that are lost as a result of that belief system and the policies that flow from them. Now, it seems to me that in the United States, right now, there's almost no military failure that can cut through. It doesn't matter how many times things fail. That's how strong this belief system is. And it's how important, why it's so important that we challenge it. Now, Republicans and Democrats, I think they have many important differences. But unfortunately, they share some common things. And certainly that belief system is one of them. In fact, I would say we know from Walter Wink that this belief system in violence is not just a U.S. thing, right? I would say all around the world it probably is believed by lots of people. It probably believed in China, in Russia, maybe even Yemen, lots of other places. But what makes it so destructive here in the United States, or why the United States is so destructive, is because we have been investing for decade after decade after decade to dominate the world militarily. So we have that, and the sheer power, military power that is part of that. And what makes it even worse, more dangerous and more destructive, is that it's linked also to another mythology, and that is the mythology of American exceptionalism. And so what unites most Democrats and most Republicans in terms of foreign policy is this belief that the United States is exceptional, that projecting U.S. military power worldwide is the key both to national security and local well-being. Somehow, the U.S. military is a kind of international savior. And if we are not strong, and if we are not the most militarily powerful country in the world, that would lead to a kind of disaster. So, militarism is the belief system. Militarization is what we enable. Now, or what we do as a result of that belief system. Now, I think one of our other really important issues that we have to grapple with, or one of the ways that we can explain where we are now, is the U.S., I think, has almost always, from the very beginning of the nation, aspired to be a great nation, a powerful nation, a global power. What changed, and it certainly has taken root, especially after World War II, is the U.S. didn't want to be a powerful nation. It wanted to be the powerful nation. And in fact, it understood, as the Project for the New American Century report made very, very clear, in the year 2000, they issued this report called America's Grand Strategy. And in it, they basically laid out what they saw as a recipe for how the United United States should permanently dominate the world. And they lay it out black and white. This is not a conspiracy theory. You can read their document. The Project for the New American Century, Rebuilding America's Defenses, September 2000. And in it, they said, the United States can achieve permanent global domination. All we need to do is carry out our grand strategy. Well, what was it? Control the world's oil supply, dramatically increase military spending, militarize space, prevent all other countries from developing nuclear weapons while modernizing our own, refuse to abide by international agreements and use our power unilaterally. I could go on, but you get the gist. Now, I will just put a parenthesis here and just say, buried in this document has spawned a lot of conspiracy theories because of this sentence in the document. And basically, what this sentence buried in the document said was, the U.S. people aren't going to like this. They're not going to go for it. Here we could dominate the world if they would just carry out our grand strategy, and they're not going to want to do it. Unless, they said, direct quote, unless we have a new Pearl Harbor. Now that was September 2000. Well, I don't believe that they carried out or plotted to make 9/11 happen. But what I think I can prove almost without doubt is that they used 9/11 as the reason, as the rationale, as the carrying out the grand strategy that otherwise they couldn't have carried out. It seems to me, I want to talk a little bit about Ukraine. So I could say a lot more about different examples of how the U.S. acted and the U.S. military was involved in transforming the United States into a permanent warfare state to be the global power rather than a global power. But I'm not gonna go there. You want to ask me more questions, you could do that. But I want to talk a little bit about Ukraine. It strikes me, one, that Putin's war is illegal. I believe Putin is guilty of lots of war crimes, and that the invasion of Ukraine was illegal. Now, having said that, we have lost a lot of credibility in being able to say much about that, because we were Putin. George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, all the people who lied us into the war in Iraq, carried out enormous death and destruction. Putin can't quite compare to that, at least not yet. So we have to acknowledge our amnesia and our willingness as citizens to not see a relationship between the past and present is a real problem. Think about, as someone who lived in Central America, I'm not at all surprised that there are lots of refugees leaving Central America and coming to the United States. But you would think, to talk about national security states that the U.S. put there, to talk about the nature of the governments that we backed, to talk about the proxy wars that the U.S. fought, the CIA overthrows of government, all those things are somehow irrelevant as we think about why there might be a crisis at the border. The same thing is true when we look at the present situation in Iraq. Every president from Brezhnev on in the Soviet Union, when it was the Soviet Union, now Russia, has said a line in the sand is NATO expansion. It was perfectly clear, and from a Russian standpoint, actually quite understandable. George Kennan, some of you may be familiar with that name. I had a quote that I'm skipping from him earlier on, in which right after World War II, he said, we're a small percentage of the world's people, we have half its wealth. The purpose of our foreign policy is to maintain the disparity. In order to do so, we're going to have to abandon human rights. So that's George Kennan. He was also a Russian, or an expert around Soviet affairs, And he said in 1997 that if the United States insisted on expanding NATO, it would be the worst foreign, it would end up being the worst foreign policy blunder in the history of the United States. This is kind of no radical. So the point I'm trying to make is, once again, Ukraine enters our minds, and we see the end of the story like on page 119. And we're not really willing to look at what the United States is doing. Right. So that's one problem that I have with Ukraine. A second problem that I have with Ukraine, if you look at one of the driving forces of the expansion of NATO, and I would say the primary force behind the expansion of NATO is the old Soviet Republic and the border states. It was that the main beneficiary of that was the U.S. military-industrial complex. And the main beneficiary of this war and the present expansion also happens to be the U.S. military-industrial complex. The other thing that happens as a result of the ongoing war, I don't believe the U.S. You can make an argument. I think you can actually make a pretty compelling argument that trying to help people in Ukraine be able to determine their own future without Russian interference. You can make that claim. But what we quickly moved away from, that's not the goal now. Within weeks, the goal became, or at least within months, the goal became to degrade or defeat the Russian military and to have regime change in Russia. Now, you will probably share with me, those of you who have had a much more direct experience with the real cost of war, that the Soviet Union and the United States throughout the Cold War used people throughout the world, especially the two-thirds world, as geopolitical cannon fodder. That's all they were. It didn't matter how many thousands, how many hundreds of thousands, how many people's lives were impacted negatively during that Cold War period by the governments that were backed by the respective countries. Well, right now, I think the United States policy has actually shifted to the point where the United States doesn't want to see a peaceful resolution, does not want to see a negotiated settlement, that wants to actually, is willing to use the Ukrainian people as a kind of geopolitical cannon fodder in an effort to weaken the Soviet Union. And I want no part of it. And I don't think that any of us should want any part of that policy. Well, let me just say a couple more things. And then I want to open up the rest of the time for any questions that you might have. You know, war is so destructive. And again, you sitting out in front of me, you have that experience more direct than I do. There's nothing good that comes from war. And when we look right now at the world that we live in, the essential human task for all of us is to build a planet that is inhabitable and that meets the essential needs of all humans. That should be the absolute fundamental goal of every human being on the planet in whatever nation he resides. And it's not an unreasonable request to say anywhere that you have lived in the world in the last several months, you have experienced, if you had any doubt about the impact of climate change, you should know more. It is. We talk about other existential threats and they may be real, but certainly the survivability of life on Earth should be a pretty high priority. Now, I have a rather simple way of saying one of the things that I would like to see happen, or about the purpose of economics. Because if we don't have a different person for economics than we now do, we will grow ourselves into death. We will grow ourselves into situations of undermining the capacity of our life system. And so what I think the purpose of an economy should be is that it produces the material foundation for meaning-based society. To produce the material foundation, the healthcare, the housing, the education, the art. There's many, 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 many things that can come under that definition. But it isn't chasing after one new thing over and over and over again at the expense of life on the planet. And then I have a very simple guide that we could use to really evaluate every decision that we make as an individual, as a family, as a city, as a state, and as a nation. I would ask us to ask two questions. First question is it good for the children? And is it good for the earth? Just ask those two questions. Is it good for the children? Is it good for the earth? Nuclear weapons are not good for children. They're not good for the earth. Foreign policies that rely on torture and intimidation, not good for children, not good for the earth. Spending $1 trillion to upgrade our nuclear arsenal, what could be more insane than that? Not good for the children, not good for the earth. Poverty, not good for the children, not good for the earth. Climate change and all the things, the drought, the floods, the fires, we're good for children, not good for the earth. So we've heard a lot of really depressing things today, I'm afraid. And I'm not a depressed person. And I tend to look at where we are, and I try to do it honestly. I try to face problems honestly. But I also try to do it through the lens of opportunity. And we have tremendous opportunities if we can get the world to pay attention to all the things we could accomplish if we were to outlaw war. If we would shift the knowledge, if we would shift the dollars, if we would shift the mindset and put that to work to the primary task that we face, which is to create a just, livable world. There is so much positive in that vision. And I think there's so much positive in that vision that actually intersects with people who wouldn't agree with me on many, many things, at least not right now. I think there are a lot of Trumpers who actually could get behind a vision that took children seriously, education seriously. It may not seem that way sometimes. But there's opportunity cost to militarism and militarization. But there are opportunities lurking as we envision a different future and work for it. Thank you.
Now you may have some questions, so step up to the mic, please. Okay. Peter. Peter Jacob. Oh, Tom. Tom first.
Is this working? Yes?
Yeah.
Our two senators have a different worldview than you. I'm wondering what you think the approach to them should be. I like a sort of logic-based politics. You know, I like a lot of conclusions that Paul Wellstone came to, but it's the conclusions that carry the weight that led me to back Paul Wellstone. But Amy Klobuchar, you know, is thinking we should send cluster bombs to Ukraine, and Tina Smith is going to have this camaraderie with her big sister, and I just can't believe that their judgment prevails. and how we can force them to logical and radical self-preservation?
Not easily. But I think what I would say is that it's one of the reasons that we have to challenge militarism. I think, I don't know, if I were in that arena, I would do a lot of things differently. But I think the reason that a lot of the people who are there, a lot of their calculation is not so much about what's right and what they deem as politically feasible. And so I think we have to change the ground of what's politically feasible. And I think that there is a little bit of a tipping point on that around climate. And I think I've gotten away from this a little bit. As a white male in my 70s, I've kind of decided to shut up and listen. So I don't give many public talks anymore. But I think I am going to follow through on something that I was kind of self-committing to a while ago. And that is I want to approach every major environmental organization in the state and make the case that if they are serious about their own objectives, they have to be serious about ending war. So I think, so back to your question, I think we need to shift the ground, the political ground a little bit. And one of the reasons to do that or one of the ways to do that is we need to be much more careful and intentional about linking one of our primary concerns, which is the military stuff and the spending priorities, to other issues that other people are caring about. And I think that's one way to get them to move. And I think the other, climate change is an unmitigated disaster, but it's also a political opportunity. And you may, probably you don't remember, some of you may remember, when I did run for Senate, I didn't start out running for Senate. I did an exploratory, and I had a website, and the website was simply most important decade. And the argument that I made all around the state, and nobody knew about me. It was a laughingstock when I entered the race, and I came fairly close to winning. And I was running on the need to end the wars, the U.S. wars, to cut the military budget by 50% over the next 5 years, and that the decisions we were going to make in the next decade, 10 years, what most important decades, were going to affect us for the rest of our lives. I still believe that. That was a lost. We lost that 10 years. We lost that decade. And now the bar has moved even further closest to an unmanageable climate change. But that reality and the fact that it has hit so many different people around the world in different manifestations is an opportunity to point out the insanity of increasing military budgets. And the goal of the United States is to get everyone except China and Russia to increase their military budget. And we have to be a counterpoint to that madness. Anybody else with a question? Yeah.
Thank you, Jack. I'm glad you brought up climate change because Bill McKibben at 350.org looked at divesting from the oil stocks in portfolios of universities. And he's been somewhat effective because why would you want to invest in something that diminishes value? That being said, my question or statement is, why is violence entertainment? It's a recruiting tool. I've been talking about the recruiting tool. But I believe that if we choose to divest from the advertising, which eliminates the economic benefits putting nothing on the food, would they be a way to, I don't know, maybe more animal documentaries or historic documentaries or telling the truth? I've almost gone completely PBS. But my question is, why is violence entertaining?
I think violence is entertaining. It's another reflection of militarization. That violence becomes an entertainment rather than something that's real and destructive. So that's one thing. I do think divestment efforts are worthwhile, and they sometimes have an impact. I think divestment from Israel because of apartheid I think that's a good strategy. I think it has raised lots of awareness, and it has some impact. I think McKibben's effort has had some impact. So that's what I'm saying. I wanted to say one more thing that I forgot to say. It's kind of related. And that is that militarism doesn't just make us more prone to military adventurism. It shows up in other ways. For example, in militarized policing, which is an enormous problem. Or in militarized homes. I read something in the New York Times the other day that said that U.S. civilians own 46% of all the civilian guns in the world. 46% of all the civilian-held guns in the world in a nation of 4% of the world's population, with 125 guns for every 100 Americans. So my point was simply to be militarism has infected many things, including military priorities, but also policing priorities, and also gun ownership priorities. All those things are impacted by that same belief system. Yeah.
I'd like to go back to the immediate problem of proxy war in Ukraine. And the most often invoked principle for the defeat of Russia is the territorial integrity of Ukraine, the sanctity of borders. But there's a competing principle in international law, and that is self-determination of people. And the people of Ukraine are not a monolith. After the unconstitutional transfer of power in 2014, the people of Crimea made it very clear that they were pleased to be separated from Kiev. And there's less evidence, but I think separatism in Donbass, a case can be made that they no longer wanted to be a part of Ukraine either. So if you wanted to elaborate a little bit on those two competing principles.
I'll just say two things real briefly. One is, I read Medea Benjamin's book laying out Ukraine, and my head was spinning, which is to say, it's a lot more complicated than our simple narrative about Ukraine. And I do think there's significant evidence that the Russian ties in Crimea were fairly strong, and so I think it is more complicated. I think the case of Ukraine is a little bit different. I think that there is more evidence of a popular move in Ukraine away from Soviet influence, Russia's influence. But that doesn't justify using Ukraine for U.S. purposes that aren't being really made public or would never be stated. You wouldn't hear Amy Klobuchar or others who support the war. You wouldn't hear them say they're going to emphasize that we're there to help a free people for claiming democratic rights. I think there are a lot of people in Ukraine that would prefer democratic rights. But that isn't a justification for the militarization of that conflict in ways that benefit the U.S. military-industrial complex and are likely to have an end game of the destruction of Ukraine and could escalate into World War III. So, and I'll give you a simple example. I mentioned that, again, it's not a radical idea that throughout Russia and earlier the Soviet Union, that it was very, very clear you couldn't send clear signals diplomatically or in other ways to the United States that expanding NATO was going to create problems. So if you wanted to avoid that, you could have had negotiations that essentially said Ukraine is going to be like Switzerland. It's going to be neutral. It's not going to join NATO. It's not going to be a satellite of Russia. It's not going to have, its military is not going to be aligned. That isn't that far-fetched. And my point is, there are possibilities for negotiation. Turkey was looking at it. China was looking at it. Brazil refused to send weapons, saying, no, we supported negotiations, and the United States is really making that almost impossible. So it seems to me that our primary role as U.S. citizens is even not to nitpick about how democratic the people of Ukraine want it to be. Probably do want to be. But that doesn't insulate us from the criticism, the U.S. from the criticism that the U.S. seems to be blocking meaningful negotiated efforts, and now with some fantasy ideas about what the outcome might be.
Thank you for your words today. Comment before my question. I think one of the pages of your speech went on the floor behind you back there. Anyway, two quick questions. First one is, you don't get very many public talks anymore. Is there the possibility that there will be access to this somewhere online?
I think it's being taped right there. Yeah. So all right. Okay.
And maybe you could also address, not only does the militarism destroy our own democracy here in the country for us citizens, that we're supposedly out there supposedly supporting and overtly fighting for of Ukraine, it's destroying their democracy because their parties have been outlawed by the person who's leading their country right now, and various other efforts that are greatly undermining democracy. Touch on that whole militarism destroying our democracy.
I found it really interesting. I was looking at Dwight Eisenhower's quote about the threat to our own democracy of the military-industrial complex. And what struck me in light of my talking about the importance of looking at militarism as a belief system was that he included in his talk that the unwarranted influence was affecting everything, including spiritual. Now, I don't think Dwight Eisenhower was thinking about that exactly the way that I am, but he wasn't wrong to think about it in those terms. So, yes, militarism and militarization policies weaken our democracy profoundly. And I don't think I can think of an example of nations that have had serious wars fought on their soil, at least recently, that hasn't ended up with a democracy that was problematic to some degree. I'll give the example of Nicaragua. My wife and I lived there for a couple years. At the time where there was some hope for the Sandinista revolution, the church, there were a lot of different parties within Nicaragua remember at the time, the CIA director, William Casey, he was quoted as saying, I have this direct quote in my writings, I don't maybe have it exactly in my head, but he said, it takes very little effort to destroy a country. And that's what they intended to do by funding the country. So we will never know what Nicaragua would have looked like had it not been for the U.S. Cultural War. But it would have been different. And even without that, Nicaragua had a difficult transition to make when a government comes to power through military power. It has less incentive to be civilian directed. It has a harder time doing that. So I think armed conflict almost always weakens democracy, even in the aftermath of the ending of those conflicts. Time for one more? Okay. One more. All right, Bill's got a question too, but we'll take this one first.
I finished up reading 1984, first time since 6th grade. Would you agree with the woman who wrote the article in the WAM newsletter that we are all being set up for a war with China in the very near future?
I don't think we're being set up for a war with China. But I think politicians, present politicians in Washington, find it expedient to focus on China in a really negative light and create a lot of fear about China. Where that leads, it may not be a good place. And so I'm very, I'm not appreciative of those leanings that are trying to, but there's many, many reasons for doing that, including it takes attention away from your own aggression in terms of your own foreign policies and your own, let me say two more things. One I was going to say, and I just cut it off so we can have more time for questions. And that was the U.S. ambition to be the global superpower. Those days are gone. It's just not going to happen. We're going to have to transition to a truly multipolar world in which the so-called great powers act a lot better and recognize that they have limited voice. It's not a completely dominant voice. And the U.S. seems to be committed to not even entertaining that prospect. I was struck by when the U.S. was basically forced to withdraw some of its troops from Iraq. And then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was quoted as, she was reassuring nations throughout the Middle East that the United States was going to position soldiers leaving Iraq in those neighboring countries throughout the Middle East. And here was the critical line: in order to prevent outside interference. I mean, only with this militarism worldview can you get away with saying something like that, where you are no longer able to see yourself as an outside power, because you are the global power. So we're going to have to help our nation transition to recognize that China's going to be a big player. I don't know if Russia is so dependent on oil for a lot of its wealth, but it'll probably be a player too, and India's going to be a player, and there's going to be others too. And I'm not saying that those are the ones who should dictate everything, but I am saying it's irresponsible to hold on to this goal of being the one global superpower. That world is just gone. Now, one thing I didn't say about Ukraine and NATO expansion is that NATO expansion in itself serves the interests of the military-industrial complex, because most of the weapons that are being gobbled up by these nations that are now afraid of Russia are U.S. weapons. And it reinforces the dependency on all of those nations on U.S. power. So in a way, it's a holding pattern for the U.S. to hold on to this idea of being the only one, the preeminent one, the indispensable one. And those ideas, quite frankly, are dangerous, especially when, as we've talked about, what we really need is an international system of cooperation to address the pressing problems of population, sustainability, regeneration of the earth. Okay, I think, you had a question. Bill had a question.
Jack, I think a lot of us would like to get into President Biden's head and wonder what he's thinking. Is there sometimes he's thinking that maybe I'm doing the wrong policy here on Ukraine? But then he thinks, well, no, I can't change now. But if he did change, he'd probably end up like JFK, dead, you know. But then he turns around and says this week that NATO will be in Ukraine when the war is over. So what's that going to do? How's Russia going to take that?
Well, I can't claim to be in George Biden's head. But I will say I appreciate a fair number of things that Biden has accomplished. I think getting anything, I was so glad I wasn't elected, because getting anything meaningfully done in Washington was virtually impossible. So the fact that we actually have hundreds of billions of dollars going into climate-related things, that's great. But as I said, or at least intimated in my talk, unfortunately, when it comes to national security, it's not that there are no differences between a Trump and a Biden, or between a George W. Bush and a Bill Clinton. The problem is that they're all committed to empire. They're all committed still to the supremacy of the United States. And I suspect that, as most presidents do, Biden has largely surrounded himself, when it comes to foreign policy, by people who are going to reinforce that this is a critical opportunity we have to weaken Russia. And he's probably listening to those voices, and I would say that is probably his inclination. He's a prominent Democrat. He supported the Iraq War initially. So when I don't want to make the case that there's no difference between these politicians. There is, and those differences matter. Do they matter enough? To me, no. That's why we have to keep working. And I would just point, I was talking earlier with someone, just say, you know, one of the calculations that my wife and I made this last election cycle was, yeah, we would do what we could in a variety of arenas politically, supporting candidates, etc. But we were going to prioritize retaking the Senate in Minnesota so that you would have a Democratic governor, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic House. Because nothing progressive at all even got a committee hearing as long as the Republicans controlled the Minnesota Senate. And flipping that Senate, did that bring everything wonderful? No. But it probably brought the most progressive changes in Minnesota in any single election cycle. That happened because people didn't just say, oh, all these politicians are the same. They're not all the same. And they're not perfect. And not everything happened that I would like to see happen. And I would say that the same thing relative to someone like Biden. I'm just absolutely dismayed that we're sending cluster weapons. There's absolutely no reason, no way to possibly justify something like that. And in the same way, I'm harshly critical of the way that the United States is getting away with its policies related to Ukraine. Mainly because I think it's going to end up mostly with the destruction of Ukraine. All right, well, thank you all.
Well, can't you picture Jack on the Senate floor? We tried to get him there, but we'll have to find somebody else, I guess, to try it. But we got to get those Democrats to elect peace candidates. That's one of the reasons I got disenchanted with the DFL, not in our state of Minnesota, but nationally. So let's try to get peace candidates elected in our Democratic Party.
Thank you so much, man.